What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Fantasy Stock Exchange here, and today I'll be going through exactly what we've learned from every NFC team this year, breaking down every single fantasy takeaway we've gotten from these teams, what we thought of each player going into the year, and ultimately how things have played out and what we can take into going into next year's fantasy football drafts. If you enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below, comment your favorite part of the video, and of course, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 20,000 subscribers. Appreciate you guys for that continued support. But before we get into the first division, as always, let's hit the intro. All right, starting off with the NFC North, and the number one team we will be referencing right now will be the Green Bay Packers. Over my shoulder right now, you guys can see the players, their point per game ranks across the season, where that ranked amongst their respective position groups, and ultimately what was the type of capital you had to pay for them in 2022 fantasy football draft. So that'll be the reference that I make to it from now on. You guys will be seeing that over my shoulder as I move into teams. But if you guys know, you're following us this offseason, we were really not in on these Green Bay Packers. We thought that they were overpriced. Losing a Hall of Fame wide receiver like Davante Adams is pretty much going to have a huge effect on this offense. And as a result, it really has. I mean, this offense this year averages 22.1 points per game and 340.9 offensive yards from scrimmage per game. If you guys made reference to last year, 26.5 points per game and 365.6 yards from scrimmage per game. It's clear that the Green Bay Packers, despite, fighting for that playoff spot, despite being, about an average to above average team in the NFL right now, clearly not the same team, clearly not the same offense that they were when they were the number one seed in the NFC entering the playoffs this time last year. In terms of their pieces, the number one piece that has really met or exceeded expectations per se would be Christian Watson. You guys do see he was drafted in round 15, has been the wide receiver 39 in points per game, 11.4 points per game. But when we condense that to weeks 10 to 16, when we really saw Watson surface onto the scene, he's averaged 6.83 targets per game in that stretch, 4.16 receptions per game, 68 yards per game, and 1.16 touchdowns per game, en route to 19.78 PPR points per game in that stretch, clearly showing that young athletic talent that the Green Bay Packers invested in them, clearly paying off at his ADP value this year. In terms of the other receivers, really just pretty much as expected. Lazard never really ascended from that fringe wide receiver 3 role because, to put it simply, he was never a good enough player to handle a wide receiver 2+ role on this offense. Out to the running backs, we thought that Aaron Jones was a bit overvalued going in round 2 due to his limited ceiling, despite having, that solid top 15 running back appeal. He ended up finishing tied for the RB11, which I would say is just about the expectation for a lot of people. If you drafted him, you're probably not complaining. But our argument with taking him at that running back 11 type of range of outcome was that we always offer upside at the running back position due to a true lack of floor given the nature of the position. So with Aaron Jones, yeah, he probably, paid off if you were taking him there round 2, 3, sure. But realistically, was not a pick that you were fully satisfied with. On the flip side, with AJ Dillon, he showed elite upside at the beginning portion and the late portion of the season, but the middle stretch was just an absolute train wreck for him. If you invested, round 5, round 6 capital into AJ Dillon, and he was giving you like 4 or 5 points per game in that middle portion of the season, you were definitely disappointed with that type of output. And then finally, Aaron Rodgers, quarterback, one of the biggest quarterback busts of the entire year. Something that's expected when you're losing a Hall of Fame caliber wide receiver. Never really looked fully comfortable throughout the year. Quarterback 21 in points per game. Realistically, if you were taking this guy in your drafts and you were set on him being your quarterback 1, many better routes you could have taken than Aaron Rodgers this year. On to the Minnesota Vikings. And in terms of this offense, this was basically the offense we expected. A top 10 offense in both yards and points per game this year. And a lot of that stemming on the passing attack, which is something that we expected going into the season as well. Starting off with the wide receivers, Justin Jefferson was everything as advertised and then some. I had, Cooper Kupp as my wide receiver 1 for the majority of the offseason, but I did switch Justin Jefferson to my number 1 overall wide receiver and a top 3 player in my rankings come August. Something that has really just aged like fine wine. As you know, this fantasy season, Justin Jefferson has had one of the best fantasy wide receiver seasons of all time. 22.6 PPR points per game. If you drafted him in the top 5, looks to be one of the biggest league winners of the entire fantasy football landscape this year. On the flip side, though, I really liked Adam Thielen a good deal to bounce back, given those strong target totals, given the strength of the offense I expected with the Vikings this year. And I expected him to step up as a result. I do think that the macro process here is still right. The offense is going to be good. This guy's shown an ability to earn targets, but realistically, expecting a 33-year-old wide receiver with persistent injury issues in prior years because he had value, he just simply wasn't the same player. Like, we expected him to return to being that, prime 30, 31-year-old Adam Thielen, where he was one of the best wide receivers in football, period. But he just simply looked like a shell of his former self as a separator on this offense. Dalvin Cook was a big hit of mine, citing him as one of my biggest fades of the entire offseason. I did think going into the year, this is a guy that could drop off in efficiency. This is a guy that, with his workload accumulating over these last few years, could wear down and ultimately be a similar asset to that of Ezekiel Elliott this year. And as it's turned out, he actually basically has had that type of year. 14.7 points per game, running back 14. This is somebody that you were drafting in the middle to late first round. And if he's giving you an RB14, less than 15 point per game output, clearly a bust this year. I thought he'd be, a fine top 12 to top 15 level running back, but those that were putting him into the Christian McCaffrey area, into the top 5 area of your drafts, and saying that he had this league winning ceiling, I simply did not see. Glad that it materialized to where, I faded Dalvin Cook. I didn't grab a lot of shares, and he didn't come back to bite me in the ass with it. Coincidentally, due to my stance on Dalvin Cook, I did have a lot of Alexander Mattison, especially in best ball. And realistically, given his archetype, we just have to accept that we face a harsh reality when a pure handcuff with incredible implied value doesn't actualize that implied value. With Alexander Mattison, we knew, if Dalvin Cook ever missed time, this would be an RB1. This would be an RB1. If Dalvin Cook, missed a game, 2 games, 3 games, Alexander Mattison would fit in. But sad reality, Dalvin Cook doesn't miss games. You drafted a guy in round 10, 11 that averages 4.3 points per game across the season. Just not going to be able to get it done in your lineup. And then finally, Kirk Cousins, quarterback 13. That's the most Kirk Cousins thing of all time. Exactly what we expected. Exactly what the entire fantasy community pretty much expected when it comes to Kirk Cousins. Next up is going to be the Detroit Lions. And starting off, we were very in on amari St. Brown's breakout heavily. The top 10 wide receiver in points per game this year, including averaging over 19 PPR points per game when healthy. I just view him as a big hit when it comes to RN and FSC. Yes, we didn't expect, we didn't foresee a top 10 level season, but we did have him as a fringe wide receiver 2 type in our rankings when a lot of people wanted to take him down due to projecting his splits last year with and without, Hawkinson and Swift in the lineup. That was the biggest debate. Can amari St. Brown earn targets? And it's pretty safe to say that amari St. Brown is independent in his target earning ability to anything else in that offense. He is going to be fed. He's going to earn his targets. Everything else will materialize behind him. Moving on to TJ Hawkinson, and this is a guy that I can take an L on personally. I called him TJ Blockinson all offseason. I said he had no upside apart from, maybe sleepwalking into a tight end 6 to 10 finish. But as we know, he's been this year's tight end 3. Over 13 PPR points per game. Really unlocked his upside, especially when he went to that Minnesota Vikings offense. Really just blew out my expectations. 12.45 PPR points per game as a Detroit Lion this year. 14 PPR points per game since he's joined the Vikings. He's just genuinely been quite easily the 3rd best tight end in fantasy, maybe arguably in football this year, given the injuries at the position. Now we head on to the running backs, and between injuries and lack of usage, DeAndre Swift was a huge fantasy football bust. Despite the efficient nature of his touches this year, it looks like, maybe there's a lack of trust with Swift in his coaching staff, but 156 opportunities in 13 games played is absolutely atrocious for somebody we expected to be a top 15 level player, period, in fantasy this year. Top 5 to 7 level running back in fantasy this year. 156 opportunities is just not going to cut it. On the flip side, though, although I did get my fair share of Jamal Williams in best ball, even I'm shocked about the opportunity share he commanded compared to DeAndre Swift this year. Out-touched him, outscored him. If you guys saw this year, 15 rushing touchdowns from Jamal Williams, top 15 level season from Jamal Williams this year. He flat out just outproduced DeAndre Swift straight up. One, obviously, DeAndre Swift going in the top 15 of your drafts, Jamal Williams going outside of the first 10 rounds. So a clear discrepancy both in value and both in overall production for Williams and Swift in this backfield this year. Now, finally, at quarterback, Jared Goff was just very solid this year, en route to a top 15 finish at the quarterback position. Someone, I didn't mind taking some shares at cost in best ball, but he definitely delivered. Top 15 level quarterback. Nobody really gave him the time of day this year. Quarterback 20, quarterback 25 off the board, and delivering top 15 is excellent for Jared Goff. Now, finally, the Chicago Bears, and I'm just going to really keep this brief. We didn't have much expectations for any pass catcher on the Bears this year, and they all stunk. The one that we really hung our hat on was going to be Darnell Mooney, somebody I wasn't really invested in because I just thought this offense was going to be bad. I didn't really think the target quality was going to be there, and as a result, yeah, he had a high target share on this team, but it led to 5.6 PPR points per game when he was healthy. drafted in round 6 to 7 for the majority of people. Big bust for a lot of people. Not really somebody I was getting on a lot of my teams regardless. So not someone I can take on the chin per se. The only skill position player that ranked top 20 at his position on this entire offense was Cole Kmet, coming in at tight end 18, outscored by the likes of guys like Greg Dulcich, Gerald Everett, Dawson Knox, you name it. So I saw, a tweet that he finished as a top 12 tight end this year, but realistically, we gotta use points per game here because he was not a big contributing factor to your lineups in fantasy football this year. A lot of replacement value on the waiver wire compared to what Cole Kmet was giving for you. Moving on to the running backs, though, and David Montgomery was even worse than our expectations. I thought he'd get a safe workload en route to maybe a mediocre back and, running back 2-level finish, staying fully away, obviously, in that round 4, round 5 area. But even that was a generous projection. He ended up finishing as a running back 3 in points per game, running back 27 overall in points per game. The reason for is that when Khalil Herbert was healthy, he chipped in a very, very good amount in this offense. And realistically, if he stayed healthy, could have potentially wrestled that running back 1 status away from David Montgomery. He looked like the better back. He was the much more explosive back, and he was a back that you were getting rounds 12 to 14 versus the rounds 4 to 5 that you were investing into a pick with David Montgomery. Finally, quarterback position, Justin Fields was absolutely phenomenal, an absolute phenom when he was on the field this year. Despite the lackluster surrounding cast that he has, due to that elite rushing ability he brings, quarterback 5 overall in PPR points per game, 20.47 points per game from the quarterback position. For someone you were drafting in rounds 10, 11, we obviously love Justin Fields given the rushing upside he had. We just didn't expect this level of ascendance. Moving on, next division, NFC West, starting off the Los Angeles Rams. Everything went wrong with the Rams in 2022. They were clearly a big miss of ours coming off their success in that Super Bowl run last year. Starting off, Cooper Kupp remained a fantastic process pick. Obviously, he was a great player, elite year the year before, massive target share, continued chemistry with the quarterback who helped him set records in 2021. And if not for injury, he would have continued that. He actually finished as the second wide receiver in points per game. But as you know, if you did draft Cooper Kupp, he did get hurt in the later portion of the season. Didn't get to experience him in the fantasy football playoffs. But before that, it looked like he was going to have potentially even another wide receiver 1 level finish. That is the level player Cooper Kupp is. And as long as he's fully healthy going into next year, going to be having a lot of my shares yet again on Cooper Kupp. Allen Robinson was the biggest disappointment of this entire offense, in my opinion. Never really looked like a good fit in the offense. Struggling to separate even before the ship went down, even when Matthew Stafford was healthy, even when this offense was healthy. Allen Robinson just looked like a shell of his former self. So I really examined his case further. It was a 29-year-old wide receiver showing a huge drop-off in play in 2021. I focused way too much on the possible situation. If I had geared my focus more so to the decline last year, I definitely could have sniffed this out. In terms of the running backs, I was in on both running backs at cost. With Akers, this was the ceiling projection. Obviously, you wanted 4th-round Akers. He's going to get, goal line work on a good offense we projected going into the year. We thought he would be fully healthy coming off of that injury based off his usage in the playoffs last year. And yeah, it was a shaky start per se. Like I will say those first 10 to 12 weeks, I don't know what was going on. And the thing that maybe even confuses me more is the fact that if we saw those first 10 to 12 weeks, we could just say, oh, yeah, no, he was a bust. He was a bust. And rightfully so, because on the full season, yes, he was a fantasy football bust. However, if you had him between weeks 13 and 17, when you're pushing for the playoffs, when you're trying to secure the championship, again, in a completely different offensive texture, we thought going into the year they were going to have a good offense. Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp on the outside, top 5 to 10 level offense. And with Baker Mayfield, a shredded up offensive line, no receiving threats on the outside, he was able to produce 18.1 PPR points per game between weeks 13 and 17. If you picked him off of waivers in this stretch, yeah, you're laughing. But if you're the one who drafted him in round 4, you are crying with what actually materialized in Cam Akers this season. Don't really have to say much about Darrell Henderson. Obviously, he was the quote-unquote lead back to start the year. But once he was cut, then he was signed to the Jaguars, and he was cut by them. And it's just a mess of a situation with Darrell Henderson. Obviously, I thought, given the strength of this offense coming into the year, that he could potentially have a big role on this team. Dead wrong on Darrell Henderson. Going to have to take that one on the chin. Finally, Matthew Stafford, as we know, he's bad to start the year. He was battling injury at the beginning portion to mid portion of the year. And then finally, he just got full-fledged injured, added to the IR, missed the last, 2 months of the season. Really, really sad with what's materialized with this Los Angeles Rams offense, given the expectation coming to the year versus what actually materialized in the fantasy football season. Moving on to the Seattle Seahawks, and in terms of their offense, it was one of the highest speculated offenses coming into the year. Let's go on to the wide receivers, though. With DK Metcalf, he's basically finishing exactly where he was expected in terms of ADP. Wide receiver 20 off the board in ADP this offseason, finished as the wide receiver 22 in points per game. Very unspectacular year, to say the least. Obviously, you saw the targets, you saw flashes of this offense being very good, but definitely a very, very inconsistent offensive effort. On the flip side, though, Tyler Lockett in the exact same offense, despite going 3 to 4 rounds later than DK Metcalf, was actually a much more valuable pick than DK Metcalf. You guys can see with Tyler Lockett versus DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett averaged 1.1 PPR points per game more in the season, also finished as the wide receiver 18 in points per game versus Metcalf finishing as the wide receiver 22, despite being drafted, as I mentioned, 3 to 4 rounds later in most drafts. Running backs here, it was clear who materialized into the better pick. When Rashad Penny was healthy, he averaged just over 10 PPR points per game and 1 target per game prior to that season-ending injury, proving that, he was a two-down back that didn't really dominate the carry share. Just wasn't very valuable for fantasy. You guys can see, but when Rashad Penny was even healthy, 10.4 PPR points per game, running back 32 in points per game, despite having that huge blow-up game really affecting the sample here. Not much value added to your fantasy football team. And on the flip side, we enter Kenneth Walker, who obviously started slow working behind Rashad Penny, but truly developed into a big-time workhorse down the stretch. RB16 in terms of seasonal points per game. But once you take the split, once he took over until he got hurt between week 6 and 12, that number jumped to the running back 6, 17.5 PPR points per game. Projecting forward, Kenneth Walker is going to be, a top 25 level pick, maybe even a top 15 to 20 level pick in fantasy drafts come next year. Rashad Penny, who knows where he's going to sign to? Who knows where he's going to go in fantasy drafts come next year? And then finally with this team, Geno Smith's season was the surprise to everyone. Top 8 level quarterback this year in terms of fantasy points per game. Absolutely phenomenal. And you were drafting him basically in the last rounds of your fantasy football drafts. On to the San Francisco 49ers, and obviously here the big, elephant in the room is that Trey Lance did go down with a season-ending injury that really threw a wrench in things early in the season. Obviously, this guy was drafted as a top 10 level quarterback, but did unfortunately get injured in week 2. If you drafted him, obviously you were devastated. I think the weapons as a whole were fine here, but the one big, big miss in terms of fantasy football was going to be Deebo Samuel. The big reason why is that he struggled to maintain that efficiency that he saw in 2021. Without the elite efficiency from last year, we saw a solid but not, elite volume wide receiver fail to live up to that career peak year we saw in 2021. Obviously phenomenal, obviously one of the best receivers in the league in 2021. The efficiency dropped in a massive way, and as a result, Deebo Samuel's utility in your fantasy football teams dropped in a massive way this year. Brandon Ayuk was very soft for where he was being drafted this year, being drafted, as the wide receiver 38 off the board, only to finish as a top 24 option in terms of points per game. Definitely, if you drafted Brandon Ayuk in round 7 to 9, you are pleased with that top 24 level finish from Ayuk this season. For George Kittle, this was a tale of two seasons. He was extremely disappointing to start the year off, but absolutely dominated down the stretch. In the fantasy football playoffs, the 3 games in the fantasy football playoffs, he averaged 22.53 PPR points per game. So if you were able to advance him, maybe you're the 4, 5, or 6 seed in your playoffs and you had George Kittle, congrats, because he probably led you on the way to your championship despite being a lower seed in your fantasy football playoffs. For the 49ers running backs, obviously the main running back that you're going to be thinking about, we will get to later on in the video with Christian McCaffrey. But starting off with the running backs that you drafted as 49ers coming into the year, Elijah Mitchell was the first back selected, yet finished outside of the top 50 in fantasy points per game, despite going inside the first 4 to 6 rounds of your fantasy drafts. 6.5 PPR points per game, definitely a big disappointment year when it comes to Elijah Mitchell. Finally, I mentioned Trey Lance, not really much to take away, got hurt in the second week of the season. That upside case that we had for him still remains intact. So I do think, although it was great process, you probably lost out on a ton here because you were drafting him in round 7 to 9, and he obviously didn't play for the final 15 weeks of the season. On to the Arizona Cardinals, and I'll keep this one very, very brief because all of these players pretty much lived up to their expectations. We were very, very high on Marquise Brown. We were about consensus with DeAndre Hopkins, and we were lower on Rondale comparative to where he was going. So starting off, Marquise Brown, before he got hurt, was an absolute baller. Top 15, top 10 level wide receiver in fantasy before getting hurt. And he still finished as a top 20 wide receiver in points per game, despite that slow start he had when he got back. Going on to DeAndre Hopkins, obviously we knew going to the year he would have that 6-game suspension with the PEDs, but once he returned, he was a top 10 level wide receiver in points per game, a lot of targets, elite target commander on this offense. He was the clear wide receiver 1 when he got back. So if you spent, around 6, round 7 level pick like it's listed here, if you were able to spend that pick, be able to hold it out and still be able to get DeAndre Hopkins back week 7 on. He definitely contributed in a large way to your lineup. And then finally with Rondale Moore, was a solid wide receiver 3-4 type of flex play when healthy. Obviously, for my expectations, I didn't even think he could be able to put on the role that he had, but finishing as the wide receiver 41 in PPR points per game, 11 PPR points per game, definitely in line where he was getting drafted. At tight end, we really like the target earning potential of Zach Ertz in this high volume passing offense. And before he got hurt, he was really damn good in fantasy football, 11.6 PPR points per game, tight end 6 pace prior to getting hurt. He was clearly going to pay off at his pick if he had not gotten hurt this season. At running back, it was clearly the James Conner show. And although we did expect good volume coming into the year, I did cite that I was worried about that lack of a difference making type of ceiling. He definitely outperformed my expectations, though. I had him as a mid, running back 2. He finished as a running back 1 in fantasy football, but he's still the archetype moving forward that I will continually fade for young ascending players, because I do think that the ceiling was always capped when it came to a guy like James Conner. Onto the quarterback, and Kyler Murray was good, but not great prior to getting hurt. About 19 points per game at the quarterback position, just under that. He was at 18.87 quarterback 7 pace across the full season. The only thing with Kyler Murray, obviously, even prior to the ACL injury, is that if you drafted him ahead of the likes of, a guy like Jalen Hurts, you were definitely disappointed. But overall, if you just drafted him and, let's say Hurts was off the board hypothetically, I think quarterback 7, 19 points per game, you could probably live with for the most part. Moving on to the NFC East, and we're starting off with the Philadelphia Eagles. Shout out if you've stuck with the FSC since the offseason. We absolutely hammered this Eagles passing attack, and it hit the complete nuts this year, especially with Jalen Hurts' ascension into a pretty good quarterback to an MVP level candidate. Starting off, A.J. Brown, wide receiver 1 in this offense. He was the superstar wide receiver we treated him as. A lot of chat this offseason, he wouldn't get enough volume. He was going, with a running back, a quarterback, hypothetically. How is he going to pay off at his ADP? And despite all of these concerns, and despite, possibly receiving a quarterback upgrade, that was the main point for us. What if Jalen Hurts is better than Ryan Tannehill? What if the Eagles do throw the ball more than the Tennessee Titans have? And both of those teams have ended up resulting in A.J. Brown being the wide receiver 7, 17.9 PPR points per game this season. Definitely a huge hit when it comes to A.J. Brown. In terms of the other ancillary pieces on this offense, Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert, they really just fell victim to the, too many mouths to feed narrative that everybody likes to cite every year. And yet, despite that, we got tremendous volume from those pieces much later in drafts versus where their talent and where their opportunity would have dictated. So for Devontae Smith, 15.1 PPR points per game, wide receiver 14 on the season, and you were getting that level of insane production in round 6 to 8. Same thing with Dallas Goedert, 11.9 PPR points per game, tight end 5 pace across the season, and you were getting that in round 6 to 8 as well with Devontae Smith. So if you drafted an Eagle stack, you drafted, A.J. Brown round 2, Jalen Hurts round 4, and then you were able to stack up Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert, especially in best ball. Yeah, you paid off tremendously. But moving on to the running back position here, and this is one I'll say I got wrong. I thought this was much more of an ambiguous backfield, and I favored the value at cost with Kenneth Gainwell, given his receiving profile, versus that of a guy like Miles Sanders. However, as we know, Miles Sanders clearly materialized into the clear lead ball carrier on this team, which I did get wrong. However, I did get right that he would not really be this difference-making player due to the lack of receiving chops he had for this offense. So although he was one of the most efficient runners, scoring a lot of touchdowns this year, 13.3 PPR points per game, running back 18. Because I faded him, I can live with that. If he was, a top 12 level running back, obviously that would be harder to stomach. But running back 18, if you drafted him there, obviously you're pretty happy. But if you faded him, it's not really going to be, a killer detriment to your fantasy football team as a whole. Then finally, Jalen Hurts, arguably the fantasy football MVP for what he did. Round 4, round 5 level pick. You're getting the quarterback 1, nearly 27 points per game on the back of 13 rushing touchdowns used on that quarterback sneak. 13 rushing touchdowns later, this guy's averaging almost 27 points per game. So a clear-cut fantasy football MVP this year. On to the next team, and my beloved Dallas Cowboys, you guys see over my shoulder. We move on, first of all, to the wide receivers. Basically exactly how I predicted things to materialize. We expected CeeDee Lamb to take that huge ascendance into superstar territory, which he has, 17.8 points per game. Wide receiver 8, you were drafting him on that 1-2 turn, maybe up to the mid-second. He was absolutely dynamite if you took him there, especially since Dak got back, nearly a 20 PPR point per game score between week 7 to 17. On the flip side, though, I was too high on Gallup looking back. I saw the potential, obviously, to contribute. Once he stepped back, once he got healthy, he would be that clear cut wide receiver two in a Dak Prescott offense, but truly didn't acknowledge just how much the ACL would zap his performance got back. I do have optimism for him moving forward, but realistically, this year was absolutely killed from that slow recovery he had from his ACL injury late in last season. Dalton Schultz is somebody I semi-faded due to the opportunity cost he represented in the mid-rounds and not having that elite ceiling. And he pretty much pulled exactly what I expected, if not even a little bit below my expectations. Thought, maybe he would sleepwalk into the tight end 4 to 9 range. And he was actually the tight end 12 in terms of PPR points per game. Going on to the running backs, though, I was all the way out on Ezekiel Elliott. It's pretty simple. You guys know my blueprint. You guys know my structure. You guys know my process at this point if you've been following the channel for a while. Older running back, huge wear and tear, diminishing opportunity share between him and Tony Pollard in 2021. And I expected that share to keep decreasing going into 2022. So as a result, I grabbed a ton of Tony Pollard, and it worked out very, very well. As you guys know, with Ezekiel Elliott, you can argue that he maybe, paid off given his ADP. Finished as, a mid to low end running back too. You got about, 13.2 points per game with Ezekiel Elliott. But realistically, that's just not my idea of paying off. If I'm drafting a round 3 to 4 player and I'm expecting him to pay off at 13.2 points per game, I would much rather take a young ascending upside wide receiver. A guy like Jalen Waddle was a guy I was all in on in this range. So if you took Ezekiel Elliott over a guy like Jalen Waddle, I don't even know what to tell you. On the flip side, though, Tony Pollard going 4 rounds later than Ezekiel Elliott, averaged 3.3 PPR points per game more than Zeke, and finished as the running back 6 in terms of points per game. So it was clear here, if you faded Ezekiel Elliott, if you got Tony Pollard later in your drafts, you clearly profited in a big way. And if you've been following the channel for a while, that was probably the exact route you took. Finally, quarterback position, Dak Prescott. He was fine when he got back, but realistically, he lost 5 games, especially after that week 1 NFL performance. You were probably in a big hole in your first 6 weeks of your fantasy season. And even when he came back, he wasn't this, top 5 level fantasy football quarterback, given the lack of the running ability compared to guys like, Justin Fields, Jalen Hurts, Washington Commanders. And as a whole, I think we were pretty much right on our Washington Commanders takes. The only spot I would say that we were probably slightly disappointed with here was that we expected, Terry McLaurin to be this low end wide receiver 2, but he actually finished as a high end wide receiver 3, finishing as the wide receiver 25 in PPR points per game. We had optimism. Obviously, this was a really good talent, new quarterback. We expected Carson Wentz to be a significant upgrade, but realistically, with Carson Wentz, when he was on the field this year, truly spread the ball around, as you'll see when we get into some of these tertiary weapons. Jahan Dotson was a clear sleeper if he stayed healthy. And if he hadn't got hurt, I genuinely think he could have been a top 36 wide receiver. So as a whole, finished as the wide receiver 41 in PPR points per game, but definitely optimistic about Jahan Dotson. Definitely going to be a big sleeper going into 2023, going into his second year as a pro on this team. Curtis Samuel was a big surprise for us, especially at the beginning of the year. Started off, tremendous in the first half of the year. Was an absolute dynamite, top 15 level wide receiver in like the first 6 weeks. But that's certainly plateaued. However, if you were able to get Curtis Samuel, maybe in the last round, maybe you picked him up off waivers in week 1, he was definitely someone you probably could have sold high. So as a result, if you got him in round 15, I would deem that a very successful pick. Going on to the running back position, both Antonio Gibson and Brian Robinson experienced, certain stretches of solid play this year. But realistically, if you drafted Antonio Gibson at his round 6 to 8 cost, an 11.1 point per game total is simply not enough for the opportunity cost you passed on in players with that range. So, I mean, if we're looking at, round 6 to 8, that's the wide receiver honeypot as a whole. A guy like Tyler Lockett was getting taken, a round or 2 later than that. So if you took, an Antonio Gibson over a Tyler Lockett, you're clearly disappointed with that pick in hindsight. Moving on to Brian Robinson, while he was solid, he was probably dropped by the initial owner, the initial drafter in your league after that slow start, recovering from that injury from his gunshot wounds. But whoever picked him back up, whoever got him off waivers, experienced, a nice couple of weeks. He was getting over 20 carries per game, contributing as, a running back 3-ish type, top 25, top 30 level running back. If you did pick him up, if you did stash him at the late part of the season, you're probably pretty happy with his performance. Moving on to Carson Wentz, and yeah, he started strong, but like anything, Carson Wentz came absolutely crashing down. Not really much else to say when it comes to Carson Wentz. Moving on to the next team, it's going to be the New York Giants, the final team of the NFC East. The biggest miss I had on the Giants this year was Kadarius Toney, wide receiver, and I cited, the dominance he had in targets per route run when he played. I projected that increased role heading into year 2, but the problem with me is that I failed to fully capture the reason why he wasn't getting that desired PT. A lot of off-field issues when it came to Toney and the Giants. As a result, he did get traded to the Chiefs, where, he's flashed at times. He's made some nice plays for them, but realistically can't consistently keep playing time there. He's a miss. Not really sure exactly what I can take away from it moving forward, despite maybe being more diligent in offseason reports, given the fact that Dable and Tony were butting heads basically all offseason. Yeah, it sucks. Definitely a miss, but realistically moving forward, I'm always going to take a young ascending second-year player, let's be honest. Not really much else to say at the wide receiver position. Obviously, Darius Slayton was a guy that emerged in season. If you picked him up off waivers, definitely paid off in a big way. But we can move on to running back, where Saquon Barkley, second-round pick, finished as the running back 5 in points per game, averaging 17.8 points per game this year. And while this was obviously a great season, a top 5 level season, he didn't exactly meet the legendary upside I had pinned for him. While it was a hit, I expect, maybe he can get back to that 20-point per game total, which he clearly couldn't do. So, yes, I aggressively ranked Saquon Barkley as a top 6 level pick going into last year. And compared to consensus, where he was going, late round 2, it aged like fine wine. However, I do think that he probably resulted in more of a top 10, top 12 level player rather than the player that I expected him to be. But moving on, finally, quarterback Daniel Jones, break a quarterback this year, put up his most efficient season as a passer while contributing 700 plus rushing yards and 7 rushing touchdowns this year. But moving on to the NFC South and starting out with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I expected, I'm not going to lie, a lot more from Mike Evans this year. 15 points per game, it's a fine mark, but not what you expected if you drafted him in the top 24 of your fantasy drafts. Obviously, last year averaged 16.4 PPR points per game. And the expectation this year was that without the presence of Antonio Brown, without the presence of Rob Gronkowski, and with Chris Godwin coming back from that late season ACL tear last year, Evans could have potentially saw his most targets since 2018, which, yes, it did happen. He did see the most targets since 2018. But the problem was, I didn't really bake in quite enough that losing Rob Gronkowski, losing Antonio Brown was going to have a huge effect on the efficiency of this passing offense. And that's exactly what we saw happen. This offense simply was not the same unit from 2021, affecting every single ancillary piece on this team, period. But speaking of Chris Godwin, mentioned that I thought he would be a slow recoverer from that ACL tear. He was the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this team when healthy. Probably rushed back in week 1 this year, got hurt, missed the next few weeks. But once he came back, this was a high volume, high end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 13 in points per game, and was the model of consistency in fantasy. Great volume, like I mentioned. But I will say that he didn't exactly have that high end ceiling on any given week. He almost played like a Jarvis Landry type of role on this team, less than 10 yards per catch, a lot of targets, a lot of receptions, but realistically wasn't the most efficient player on those targets. In terms of the other wide receivers on this team, Russell Gage and Julio Jones, we were fully out on them. We didn't like them at all. We didn't want them at their value. Around 10 to 12, people were citing as big steals. We definitely didn't view it that way. And I mean, it's worked out like fine wine for us. 9.4 points per game for Russell Gage, 7 points per game for Julio Jones. Julio Jones obviously being very washed. Russell Gage not exactly getting that big figure of wide receiver 3, quote unquote, playing time like many expected coming into the year. Running back, I was in on Leonard Fournette, took some shots at Rachaad White late in draft. And although, both were adequate payoffs at ADP, if I had known then what I'd know now about Leonard Fournette's season, I definitely would have opted for someone else at that 2-3 turn spot. Extremely inefficient, battling injury, battling age, not the profile of running back I want to invest early picks into. And I was really blinded by his end of season run last year and projection for this offense coming into the year. Finally, the talisman of it all, Tom Brady, was a huge miss on our part. Thought he would be, a fringe tier 1, tier 2 type of quarterback. We expected him to lead the league in passing volume like he did last year, be up there in touchdowns like he did last year. But between the divorce with Gisele Bundchen, fall off in his own play, losing some of his weapons, Tom Brady definitely disappointed en route to a quarterback 15 point per game season, despite being drafted in rounds 5 to 8 coming into the year. Next team, moving on to the New Orleans Saints, and the first player that I was basically all in on in this division as well was Michael Thomas. And Michael Thomas flattened out in the most Michael Thomas way I've ever seen. First few games when I was watching him, I felt like a genius. I thought I was getting, MT's dominant target earning ability, extreme discount, just for him to be a top 10 wide receiver in those first 3 games. I thought, this is going to be a stud. This is going to be a league-winning type of wide receiver. You got him much later than he should have went, and now he's going to make everybody feel bad if they did not take him. However, the only ones that felt bad were the ones that did take him, because that first 3 game stretch was a mirage. Obviously, we saw that he got hurt. He would go into the injury report going into week 4. We thought, maybe he'd miss a week or two, maybe 3 weeks at max. Definitely would be back for the middle portion going on in the season. But then it just lingered on. Then 3, 4 weeks later, we're like, okay, well, where's Michael Thomas? Is he coming back? Is he coming back? Is he coming back? All to the point where he never came back. So we're able to speculate. We're able to, point to the fact that he was a 17-point per game scorer when he was healthy, but 3 games simply is not going to do it. Michael Thomas is somebody I don't know what to do with going forward. Like, if he's in the double digit round, sure, maybe I'll probably take a stab at that point. But realistically, if he's going in any single digit rounds in fantasy this year, should not be a target of mine. And somebody I'm going to have to take on the chin because I definitely had high expectation coming into the year. However, a receiver in this offense that did pay off, another target of mine in the single digit rounds, was Chris Olave, that rookie top 12 level pick from Ohio State. Obviously loving the prospect coming from Ohio State and prioritizing the youth aspect that he brought. Ended up finishing as the wide receiver 26 in terms of PPR points per game, despite being drafted in the round 8 to 10 area. So definitely a big hit when it comes to Chris Olave in fantasy football this year. Moving on to running back, and point blank simple, Alvin Kamara was a flat out bust. Terrible offense, regressed in his play on his own. And the problem with Alvin Kamara for me is that I cited, the age and touch apex when it came to players like Dalvin, Aaron Jones. But I just feel like I let extreme personal bias really keep me in believing with Alvin Kamara. If I stuck to my process here, I definitely could have seen this coming. Then finally, Jameis Winston was solid when he was a starter. The problem is he got hurt, got benched. Andy Dalton, rest is history. But moving on to the Atlanta Falcons, passing volume was so abysmal in this offense to the point where, despite Kyle Pitts having these strong peripherals of his target earning ability, it truly didn't matter. You're compounding that with the fact that he had a season-ending injury, got put on IR about the mid-portion of the season. He was easily one of the biggest butts of the entire fantasy season, going in rounds 3 to 4, paying off 7.6 PPR points per game when he was healthy, and then ultimately got hurt. Rookie wide receiver Drake London was very solid in spurts this year, but specifically at the beginning and the end of the year. His midseason stretch really left him unplayable. However, moving forward, really strong target share, over a 28% target share on the season when it comes to Drake London. Somebody I'm going to be taking a ton of stabs on going into 2023 fantasy football drafts. Running back position, Cordero Patterson was someone I was, fine with if he fell. If he found to, round 9, round 10, I was interested in getting shares of him there. But realistically, not somebody I was reaching up the board to draft. The one that I was really in on, especially at cost, was Tyler Algier, his second running back, the rookie running back out of BYU. Big, strong, tough runner between the tackles, could contribute on third downs. And as a result, we did see his play really, really skyrocket by the end of the year. Became a steady top 25, top 30 level running back, especially come fantasy football playoff time. So if you took, Cordero Patterson, 12.1 points per game, you're definitely thrilled with that output. But if you were able to hold on to Tyler Algier, maybe stashed him or picked him up in the midseason, he definitely paid off at the end of the year. But finally, the pivot that held them all together for the majority of the year, Marcus Mariota, quarterback, 18 in points per game, nearly 16 points per game. Not really someone I had a strong take on coming into the year, but somebody I was fine mixing in best ball, given the rushing ability that he displayed. Moving on to the final team of the video and starting off with DJ Moore, someone I was extremely excited upon coming into the year. Alpha target commander, potentially playing with the best quarterback of his career entering the season. I was fine with getting shares all over in round 3, round 4. Definitely thought that DJ Moore would experience that breakout season, but I was dead wrong. Baker Mayfield was an absolute train wreck, and DJ Moore got off to a start this year that rendered him nearly unusable in fantasy football. We did see, however, a late season stretch, 16.6 PPR points per game in the last 5 games of the season, and totaled 4 games with over 18 PPR points. And I'm excited to see if we could potentially get him at a discount entering next year, because I'm still evident with the talent. I still think that the Carolina Panthers are going to be able to have a quarterback upgrade via the draft, via free agency. I do think that anything's better than Baker Mayfield at this point, as we saw with even Sam Darnold at the final tail mark of the year. Christian McCaffrey was the consensus 102 in fantasy football entering the year as a Carolina Panther. Obviously, as a Panther this year, he was solid, but not really the type of player we expected. 19.66 PPR points per game in his stretch as a Carolina Panther. But his season truly took off once he got traded to the 49ers. He averaged 22.2 PPR points per game as a 49er, including 23.7 PPR points per game week 8 on. Obviously, that week 7 game, trying to get acclimated to the offense. Obviously, got traded midweek. played on the Sunday, like 3 games of learning the playbook, didn't really get that full touch workload. But once he was fully a Niner, once he got fully invested into that team, nearly 24 points per game is the ceiling that we were craving when we were drafting Christian McCaffrey as high as we were. So he's been the league winner that I built him as being, but obviously got there on a much different pathing than I expected. And then finally, D'Onta Foreman, as a result of the Christian McCaffrey trade, became a solid running back 3 type down the stretch. Obviously, this Carolina team really wanted to run the ball, really wanted to establish that line of scrimmage under Steve Wilks. And as a result, D'Onta Foreman provided some significant value, especially if you had him stashed, or maybe once the Christian McCaffrey news came out, you're able to add him midseason. So that's the truth. The Carolina Panthers, really run dominant team. Some flashes at the end of the season from DJ Moore, but realistically, as a whole, probably a fantasy wasteland of a team. But either way, I appreciate you guys for making it to the end of this video. Obviously, a much longer video than we're used to. A lot of content that we had to get to. So if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Of course, subscribe to the channel on the road to 20,000 subscribers. Comment down below the type of videos you want to see this offseason, whether it's reflection content, dynasty content, maybe way too early redraft content, you name it. Us over here, myself and Corey at Fantasy Stock Exchange, are happy to help in terms of your needs for fantasy football content. But either way, take care. Enjoy.
Wire me the money.